The massive ships came without warning. They dropped from the sky like falling mountains, their dark hulls blocking out the sun above every major city on Earth. People stopped in the streets and looked up at the alien vessels that hung in the air like storm clouds that would never move. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Liberty, watching the largest ship position itself over New York City. The alien craft was so big that it cast shadows for miles in every direction. Jake had been in the Navy for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "Sir, we're getting a signal," called out Lieutenant Amy Parker from the communications station. "It's coming from the big ship." Jake walked over to the radio equipment. The voice that came through the speakers was cold and mechanical, speaking perfect English through some kind of translation device. "People of Earth, you will send your leaders to our command ship. You have 1 hour to comply." The transmission ended. Jake looked around at his crew. Every face showed the same mix of fear and determination that he felt in his own chest. They all knew their world had just changed forever. Within 30 minutes, President Linda Hayes was aboard a military transport heading toward the alien ship. Jake watched from the deck as the small aircraft disappeared into the belly of the massive vessel. General Ryan Clark stood beside him, his jaw set in a hard line. "What do you think they want?" Jake asked. "The same thing every conqueror wants," Ryan replied. "Everything." Inside the alien ship, President Hayes walked through corridors that seemed designed for beings much larger than humans. The walls were made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Armed alien guards flanked her on both sides as she was led deeper into the ship. The aliens were tall, nearly 8 feet in height, with thick skin that looked like natural armor. Their faces had multiple eyes that glowed with an amber light, and their mouths were filled with sharp teeth. They moved with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. President Hayes was brought into a vast chamber where dozens of alien officers stood around a central platform. At the center stood the largest of them all, wearing what appeared to be a military uniform covered in symbols and decorations. "I am Admiral Kexthor," the alien said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "Supreme Commander of the Zephyrian Confederation Fleet." Hayes stood straight, meeting the alien's multiple eyes without flinching. "I am President Linda Hayes, leader of the United States and representative of Earth." Kexthor's mandibles clicked, together in what might have been amusement. "Representative of Earth, how quaint. Do you know why you're here, human?" "I assume you're going to tell me." The alien gestured to the air, and suddenly the chamber filled with holographic images. Hayes watched in horror as the displays showed world after world being destroyed. Cities turned to glass under alien weapons, populations being marched into ships like cattle, entire planets reduced to lifeless rocks floating in space. 17 star systems, Kexthor said, his voice filled with pride. 17 civilizations that once thought themselves mighty. All now serve the Confederation, or they serve as examples to others. Hayes forced herself to keep watching as more images flashed before her eyes. She saw species she had never imagined, all of them either enslaved or extinct. The scope of the destruction was beyond anything in human history. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because you need to understand your position," Kexthor replied. "The Zephyrian Confederation has never been defeated. We have conquered races that could split planets with their minds. We have destroyed fleets that could travel between galaxies in moments. We have ended civilizations that had existed for millions of your years." The holographic displays changed, now showing Earth as seen from space. Red targeting indicators appeared over every major city, every military base, every population center. "Your species has 48 of your hours to make a choice," Kexthor announced. "Submit to Confederation rule, accept our governors, surrender your weapons, and your deaths will be quick when we no longer have use for you. This is the path of mercy." Hayes felt her blood turn cold, but she kept her expression steady. "And the other option?" Kexthor's eyes seemed to glow brighter. "Resist us, and we will turn your world into a monument to the folly of defiance. Every city will burn. Every human will die slowly, Your planet will become a wasteland that serves as a warning to other species who might consider opposing us." The chamber fell silent, except for the low hum of the ship's systems. Hayes looked around at the alien officers, all of them watching, her with the same confident expectation. They had done this before many times. They knew how this would end. 48 hours, she said slowly. 48 hours, Kexthor confirmed. Choose submission and live as slaves until we tire of you. Choose resistance and die as examples to others. These are the only options the Confederation offers. Hayes was escorted back through the corridors to her transport. As she was led away, she could hear the alien officers talking among themselves in their own language. Even without understanding the words, she could hear the tone of certainty in their voices. They had no doubt about how this would end. Back on Earth, Jake Morrison received the report from General Clark about the president's meeting. The news spread quickly through the military command structure and then to the civilian population. The choice facing humanity was simple and terrible: become slaves or die fighting. But as Jake stood on the deck of his ship, looking up at the alien vessels that hung over his world like a promise of doom, he found himself thinking about something else entirely. In all their speeches about conquest and submission, the aliens had revealed something important about themselves. They could only imagine two possible responses to their ultimatum. They had conquered 17 star systems because every other species had chosen one of those two options. But what if there was a third choice? What if humanity simply refused to play by their rules? Jake smiled grimly as he watched the alien ships. The Zephyrians thought they knew everything about conquest and defeat. They were about to learn something new about the human species, something that might surprise them more than they could possibly imagine. The clock in the White House Situation Room showed 47 hours and 59 minutes since the alien ultimatum. President Hayes sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her advisors and military leaders. Captain Morrison had been called in from his ship, along with Colonel Steve Williams and Major Kate Sullivan. Everyone in the room knew what the aliens expected. They had seen the pattern from the holographic displays. 17 civilizations had faced this same choice, and all 17 had chosen either submission or destruction. The Zephyrians were confident they knew how this story would end. "The transport is ready, Madam President," General Clark reported. "Admiral Kexthor is expecting you to return with our surrender documents." Hayes looked around the table at the faces of her advisors. Some showed fear, others showed anger, but all of them showed the same determination that had carried humanity through its darkest hours before. "What documents are we taking?" asked Colonel Williams. Hayes stood up from her chair. "None." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room understood what she meant, but Captain Morrison felt compelled to ask anyway. "None, ma'am?" "That's correct, Captain. We're taking no documents, no surrender protocols, no terms of submission." Hayes walked to the window and looked out at the alien ship hanging over Washington, D.C. "We're going to give them something they've never received before." 30 minutes later, President Hayes was once again aboard the alien flagship. But this time she walked through the corridors with empty hands and a calm expression that seemed to puzzle her alien escorts. They kept looking at her hands as if expecting to see the surrender documents that weren't there. In the main chamber, Admiral Kexthor waited with his officers. The room was arranged exactly as it had been during their first meeting, with the alien command staff positioned around the central platform like judges at a trial. The only difference was the expectant atmosphere. They were ready to receive humanity's submission and add another species to their catalog of conquered races. "President Hayes," Kexthor said as she was brought before him, "have you brought your species' surrender protocols?" Hayes looked directly into the alien's primary eyes. Around the chamber, alien officers leaned forward slightly, preparing to witness another routine conquest ceremony. "No," she said simply. The words seemed to echo in the vast chamber. Kexthor's mandibles clicked together several times, a sound that his officers recognized as confusion. In his 300 years of military service, spanning dozens of conquests, he had never heard that particular response. "You refuse to submit to Confederation rule?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "No," Hayes repeated with the same calm tone. Kexthor's secondary eyes swiveled toward his tactical officers, seeking guidance that none of them could provide. The response made no logical sense according to their understanding of conquered species behavior. "Then you have chosen extinction," the Admiral stated, his voice regaining some of its authority. "Your species will resist, and we will destroy you as an example to others." Again, Hayes gave the same response. "No." This time, the confusion among the alien officers was visible. Several of them began speaking in their own language, their voices carrying tones of uncertainty that none of them had ever experienced during a conquest operation. Kexthor raised one of his armored hands for silence. "Explain your position, human." "You reject submission to the Confederation?" "No." "You reject the choice of resistance and destruction?" "No." "Then what is your answer?" "No." Back on Earth, Captain Morrison stood in the military command center, coordinating with resistance leaders around the globe. The President's strategy was working exactly as planned. Every second she kept the aliens confused was another second for humanity to prepare for what was coming. "She's buying us time," Morrison told Colonel Williams. "Look at the alien communication patterns. Their fleet commanders are requesting guidance from higher authority. They've never encountered this situation before." Major Sullivan pulled up tactical displays showing alien ship positions around the globe. "Their formation hasn't changed since yesterday. They're waiting for something, but they don't know what." The genius of the President's approach was becoming clear to everyone in the command center. The Zephyrians had conquered 17 star systems using the same basic strategy: present 2 unacceptable choices and force the enemy to pick one. But humanity had found a third option that didn't fit their conquest protocols. "What happens when they figure out what we're doing?" asked Colonel Williams. Morrison smiled grimly. "By then, it'll be too late. We've studied their pattern. They give species 48 hours to choose, then they act on whatever choice was made. But what if no choice is made? What if their target simply refuses to participate in their system?" Aboard the alien flagship, Admiral Kexthor was experiencing something he had never felt before: genuine uncertainty. His entire military doctrine was based on the predictable behavior of conquered species. They either submitted or resisted. There were no other options in Confederation military theory. "Perhaps the human doesn't understand the choice," suggested one of his officers. Kexthor considered this possibility. "Human Hayes, do you understand that you must choose between submission and resistance?" "No," Hayes replied. "Do you understand that there are only 2 options available to your species?" "No." "Do you understand that your time is running out?" "No." The Admiral's frustration was becoming apparent to his subordinates. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never encountered a species that simply refused to acknowledge the reality of their situation. Every other race had eventually chosen one path or the other. They might negotiate for better terms, they might try to buy more time, but they always eventually made a choice. "What do you understand?" Kexthor demanded. Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. "I understand that you believe we only have 2 choices. I understand that you've never met a species that refused both of them, and I understand that you have no idea what to do next." The truth of her words hit the alien officers like a physical blow. For the first time in Confederation history, their standard conquest protocol was failing not because of superior enemy technology or tactics, but because their target simply refused to play by the rules. "You cannot refuse to choose," Kexthor said, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. "No," Hayes said again. The word had taken on an almost mystical quality among the alien crew. Some of the younger officers had begun to whisper that it carried some form of supernatural power, that humans possessed mental abilities unknown to Confederation science. But Hayes knew the truth was much simpler than that. Humanity had learned something over thousands of years of war, survival, and struggle. Sometimes the most powerful response to an impossible choice was to refuse to make it at all. As the deadline approached, Admiral Kexthor realized he was facing a crisis that his military training had never prepared him for. His conquest fleet was paralyzed not by enemy action, but by the simple refusal of one human to participate in a system that had worked perfectly for centuries. The single word no was about to break the psychological foundation of the galaxy's most powerful military force. While President Hayes continued her psychological warfare aboard the alien flagship, something remarkable was happening across Earth. Instead of panic or despair, humanity was mobilizing in ways the Zephyrians had never witnessed in their 3 centuries of conquest. Dr. Lisa Chang worked frantically in her laboratory deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. Around her, teams of scientists and engineers were doing something that should have been impossible. They were adapting human technology, using pieces of alien equipment that had been secretly recovered from previous encounters. The power coupling is compatible, she called out to her team. Their energy systems work on the same basic principles as ours, just at a much higher level. Her assistant, Dr. Ben Rodriguez, looked up from his workstation. How is that possible? They're supposed to be centuries ahead of us. Lisa smiled grimly as she connected another component. That's exactly the problem. They're so advanced that they've forgotten how to think like primitives. Their technology is designed for conquest, not for dealing with desperate resistance. The discovery had come from analyzing wreckage from a Zephyrian scout ship that had crashed in the Pacific 3 days before the main invasion fleet arrived. What they found was shocking. The aliens had built their entire technological base around the assumption that their enemies would fight using conventional military tactics. They've never faced an enemy that uses guerrilla warfare, Lisa explained, to the video conference that connected her lab with resistance cells around the world. Their shields are designed to stop large military attacks, not thousands of small ones. Their communication systems are built to coordinate massive fleets, not to deal with constant interference from primitive transmitters. Captain Morrison watched the conference from his command center aboard the USS Liberty. Around him, his crew was making preparations that would have seemed insane just days before. They were preparing to fight an interstellar empire using technology that was barely more advanced than what humans had possessed 50 years ago. "Ma'am, are you saying we can actually hurt them?" asked Major Kate Sullivan from her position in London. "I'm saying their technology has a weakness they don't even know about," Lisa replied. "They've optimized everything for fighting other advanced civilizations. They have no defense against an enemy that's willing to use crude, desperate tactics." The plan that emerged from these discoveries was audacious in its simplicity. While the Zephyrians expected either submission or conventional military resistance, humanity was preparing something entirely different. Coordinated chaos on a global scale. Colonel Steve Williams coordinated with civilian populations across 6 continents. Factory workers were building simple electromagnetic pulse devices using instructions downloaded from the internet. Farmers were preparing supply lines for resistance fighters. Students were learning to hack into communication systems using techniques that were decades old but completely unknown to alien technology. "The beauty of it is that we're not trying to out-tech them," Williams explained to his staff. "We're trying to out-crazy them. They've conquered 17 civilizations that all fought by the same rules. We're going to show them what happens when someone breaks those rules." The Zephyrians had made a critical error that was becoming clear to everyone involved in the resistance planning. They had given humanity 48 hours to think, and humans were very good at finding creative solutions when their backs were against the wall. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Brooks was coordinating resistance efforts across North America when she received a message that changed everything. "Sir, we're getting reports from around the globe. Every major city, every military base, every communication center. People aren't running away from the alien ships, they're moving toward them." Morrison looked at the tactical displays with growing amazement. Instead of fleeing from the alien threat, human populations were positioning themselves as close as possible to the invasion forces. It was the opposite of every prediction the military planners had made. "They're not scared anymore," he realized. "The president's strategy is working. People have stopped seeing this as an unstoppable force and started seeing it as a problem to solve." The change in human behavior was subtle, but profound. The Zephyrians had counted on fear and despair to paralyze their enemies, just as it had with every other species they had conquered. But humanity's refusal to accept the basic premise of conquest was spreading through the population like a virus. Aboard the flagship, President Hayes was still maintaining her psychological assault on the alien command structure. Every few hours, Admiral Kexthor would demand clarification of humanity's position, and every time she would give the same maddening response. "Your final answer is no?" the Admiral would ask. "No," Hayes would confirm. "To submission? No. To extinction? No." The word had begun to take on an almost magical quality among the Zephyrian crew. Some of the alien soldiers had started to believe that humans possessed some form of mental power that could bend reality itself. The idea that a species could simply refuse to acknowledge the laws of conquest was so foreign to their thinking that they were beginning to question their own understanding of the universe. But the real preparation happening on Earth was far more practical than mystical. Dr. Chang's teams had discovered that Zephyrian technology relied heavily on centralized control systems. Their ships, their weapons, their communication networks all operated on the assumption that command authority would never be challenged by chaotic, uncoordinated attacks. "It's like they've never heard of asymmetric warfare," Ben Rodriguez observed, as he watched test results from their electromagnetic pulse experiments. "Their entire fleet is vulnerable to the kind of attacks that humans perfected fighting each other." The resistance network was growing by the hour. People who had never thought of themselves as fighters were learning to build simple but effective weapons. Communication specialists were preparing to jam alien frequencies using techniques that were primitive but completely unexpected. Even children were being taught to recognize alien equipment and how to disable it using nothing more than household items. Colonel Williams received reports from resistance cells around the world. "London reports ready. Tokyo reports ready. Sydney, Moscow, Cairo, all reporting ready status." He looked up at Morrison with something approaching amazement. "Sir, I think we actually have a chance." Morrison nodded slowly. The Zephyrians had expected to face either cowering slaves or desperate but conventional military resistance. Instead, they were about to encounter something that had never existed in their experience. An entire species that had decided the rules of conquest simply didn't apply to them. As the 48-hour deadline approached, Admiral Kexthor was becoming increasingly agitated. His officers were requesting guidance from Confederation High Command, but even they had no protocols for dealing with a species that refused to participate in their own conquest. The single word "no" had evolved from a simple refusal into something much more dangerous, proof that the Zephyrian system of conquest had a fatal flaw. They had never encountered an enemy that was willing to reject the fundamental assumptions of warfare itself. Humanity was about to teach the galaxy's most powerful empire a lesson they would never forget. The 48-hour deadline arrived like a thunderclap across Earth's surface. In the Situation Room of the White House, Captain Morrison and his team watched the clock count down to 0. Around the world, resistance cells held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Aboard the Zephyrian flagship, Admiral Kexthor stood before his command staff, his multiple eyes glowing with frustration and something approaching desperation. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never faced a situation like this. Every protocol, every strategy, every piece of military doctrine had failed against humanity's simple refusal to participate in their own defeat. "The deadline has passed," announced his tactical officer. "The humans have not submitted. They have not declared resistance. They have not responded to our ultimatum in any recognizable way." Kexthor's mandibles clicked together rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation that his crew had never witnessed before. "Then we will make the choice for them," he declared, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "If they cannot choose between submission and extinction, we will demonstrate the consequences of defiance." President Hayes stood in the center of the alien command chamber, watching as the Admiral struggled with a problem that had no solution in Zephyrian military theory. When he turned his primary eyes toward her, she saw something she had been hoping to see, the first crack in his absolute confidence. "Since your species refuses to make a rational choice," Kexthor announced, "the Confederation will choose for you. Prepare orbital bombardment of your primary population centers. We will reduce your cities to glass and ash, and use your world as an example to others who might consider defying us." Hayes remained completely calm. "No," The word hit the alien command staff like a physical blow. Even faced with imminent destruction, the human representative maintained her impossible position. Several junior officers began speaking nervously among themselves in their own language. "You cannot refuse destruction," Kexthor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "When our weapons fire, your cities will burn regardless of your answer." "No," Hayes repeated with the same unshakable calm. On Earth, the moment of truth had arrived. Captain Morrison activated the global communication network that connected every resistance cell on the planet. "All units, this is Earth Command. Operation Rejection is now active. Show them what humanity really means." The response was immediate and devastating, but not in the way the Zephyrians expected. As their weapons powered up to begin the orbital bombardment, humanity struck back with a coordinated assault that was unlike anything in the aliens' experience. Dr. Lisa Chang's electromagnetic pulse devices activated simultaneously across 6 continents. The weapons weren't powerful enough to damage the massive alien ships, but they didn't need to be. They were designed to disrupt the Zephyrian communication networks that relied on constant coordination between thousands of smaller systems. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Alien ground installations went dark as their power systems overloaded. Communication arrays that had been monitoring human activities suddenly found themselves jammed by signals coming from garage-built transmitters operated by teenagers and amateur radio enthusiasts. But the real shock came from the human response to the alien threats. As Zephyrian forces attempted to coordinate their bombardment, they discovered something that shattered their understanding of warfare itself. Colonel Steve Williams's forces in New York, positioned directly beneath the alien flagship, refused evacuation orders from their own command. When offered the chance to retreat to safety, they responded with the same word that had bewildered the alien leadership: no. Major Kate Sullivan's resistance fighters in London, surrounded and outnumbered 50-1 by alien ground troops, declined offers of safe surrender. When the aliens demanded they lay down their weapons and submit, they gave the same response: no. The pattern repeated across every continent, in every city, at every point of contact between human and alien forces. Humanity would not submit, would not surrender, would not retreat, would not negotiate, and would not acknowledge the possibility of defeat under any circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Brooks coordinated the defense of Washington, D.C. as alien. Dropships landed throughout the city. Her forces were outnumbered and outgunned by factors that should have made resistance meaningless. But when alien commanders offered terms for surrender, her response echoed through the streets of the capital: no. The psychological impact on the Zephyrian forces was unlike anything in their military history. They had conquered 17 star systems because every other species had eventually chosen either submission or traditional military resistance. They had never encountered an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge the concept of defeat. Admiral Kexthor watched his tactical displays with growing horror as reports came in from around the planet. His ground forces were not being defeated by superior technology or brilliant strategy. They were being psychologically dismantled by an enemy that would not accept the basic rules of warfare. "Sir, the Beijing unit is requesting guidance," reported his communications officer. "They have surrounded a human resistance cell, but the humans refuse to surrender or retreat. They just keep fighting as if defeat is impossible. Tell them to destroy the resistance cell," Kexthor ordered. They did, sir. But when they moved to the next location, they found more humans who gave the same response. And when they destroyed that position, they found more. The humans seem to believe that individual defeat is irrelevant as long as their species continues to refuse. Kexthor felt something he had never experienced before: fear. Not fear of death or defeat, but fear of the incomprehensible. He was facing an enemy that operated according to rules that made no logical sense. The breaking point came when Lieutenant Colonel Ben Rodriguez's civilian networks managed to hack into the Zephyrian communication systems. Using techniques that were decades old by human standards but completely unknown to alien technology, they flooded every alien device with a simple message. Across the Zephyrian fleet, on every screen, every communication device, every tactical, Display, the same word appeared in perfect Zephyrian script. No. The message repeated endlessly, accompanied by images of human resistance fighters who continued fighting despite impossible odds, civilian populations who refused evacuation from combat zones, and children who looked directly into alien cameras and spoke that single, devastating word. For the first time in Confederation history, an invasion force began to experience mass psychological breakdown. Zephyrian soldiers, faced with an enemy that simply would not acknowledge defeat, began to question the fundamental assumptions of their civilization. "What kind of species are they?" whispered one alien officer. "They're impossible," replied another. "They refuse to be conquered, but they also refuse to win. They just refuse everything." Admiral Kexthor stood in the center of his command chamber, watching as his perfectly planned invasion collapsed not from military defeat, but from psychological impossibility. His forces were intact, his weapons were functional, his technology was superior, but none of it mattered against an enemy that simply would not play by the rules. President Hayes watched the alien commander's composure finally shatter completely. His multiple eyes were wide with something approaching panic, and his armored hands were shaking as he tried to process what was happening to his invasion force. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking with fear and confusion. Hayes smiled. "We are the species that says no to the impossible, no to the inevitable, and no to anyone who tells us we have no choice. We are humanity, and we do not accept your rules." The single word that had started as a simple refusal had become something much more powerful, proof that the will to resist could be stronger than any weapon ever built. The collapse of the Zephyrian invasion force happened faster than anyone had expected. Within 12 hours of Operation Rejection's launch, Admiral Kexthor's perfectly coordinated fleet had devolved into chaos. Reports were flooding in from across the galaxy as news of humanity's impossible resistance spread through Confederation communication networks. Captain Morrison stood in the command center aboard the USS Liberty, reading reports that seemed too good to believe. "Sir, we're getting confirmation from monitoring stations worldwide. The alien fleet is confused. Their formation is breaking apart. Some ships are moving away from Earth entirely." The breakthrough had come when Dr. Lisa Chang's teams realized something crucial about Zephyrian psychology. Their entire civilization was built on the concept of inevitable conquest. They had never developed contingency plans for dealing with failure because they had never imagined failure was possible. "It's like they've never heard the word no before," Dr. Ben Rodriguez explained during an emergency briefing with resistance leaders around the globe. "Their language has concepts for submission and resistance, but not for refusal to participate. We've introduced an idea that their minds literally cannot process." Aboard the flagship, President Hayes watched as Admiral Kexthor's command staff fell apart around him. Alien officers who had served together for decades were arguing in their own language, their voices filled with panic and confusion. Some were demanding immediate withdrawal from Earth's solar system. Others were calling for the complete destruction of the planet. None of them could agree on what to do next. "This is impossible," Kexthor muttered, staring at tactical displays that showed his ground forces retreating from human population centers without having been defeated. "They cannot simply refuse to be conquered." "But they have," Hayes replied calmly. "And now your entire invasion force is paralyzed because you never prepared for this possibility." The Admiral's multiple eyes focused on her with something approaching desperation. "You must choose. Every species chooses. It is the natural order of the universe." "No," Hayes said for what felt like the 1,000th time. "There is no natural order that says we must accept your authority. There is no law that says we must choose between your options. And there is nothing you can do to force us to participate in our own conquest." The psychological impact of humanity's resistance was spreading beyond Earth's boundaries. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Brooks received intelligence reports indicating that 3 other species within the Zephyrian Confederation had declared independence, inspired by humanity's example. The word no was becoming a rallying cry across the galaxy. "Ma'am, we're getting reports from the Altarian system," Brooks reported to Morrison. "They've expelled their Confederation governors and are demanding complete autonomy, They're using the same strategy we developed. They're just refusing to acknowledge Confederation authority. Morrison felt a surge of pride mixed with amazement. Humanity's simple refusal to accept an impossible choice was triggering a revolution that spanned multiple star systems. The Zephyrian Empire, which had seemed invincible just days before, was beginning to crumble from within. The final blow came when Colonel Steve Williams's civilian hackers managed to access the Confederation's central communication network. Instead of trying to steal information or cause damage, they did something much more devastating. They broadcast humanity's message directly to every Zephyrian ship, base, and colony in the galaxy. The message was simple and devastating. The humans said no. Why can't you? The psychological effect on Confederation forces was immediate and catastrophic. For the first time in their history, Zephyrian soldiers began to question whether conquest was truly inevitable. If one species could simply refuse to be conquered, what did that say about all the others who had submitted over the centuries? Admiral Kexthor watched helplessly as his invasion force disintegrated around him. Ship commanders were requesting permission to withdraw. Ground forces were abandoning their positions without orders. His own crew was looking at him with expressions he had never seen before. Doubt. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "we're receiving communication from Confederation High Command. They're ordering us to withdraw from this system immediately." Kexthor's mandibles clicked together in shock. "Withdraw? But we haven't completed the conquest." "Sir, High Command says the humans have created a psychological contamination event. They're worried that continued exposure to human resistance methods will spread to other Confederation forces." The Admiral stared at President Hayes, who stood in the center of his command chamber with the same calm expression she had maintained for 3 days. She had not moved from her position, had not raised her voice, had not threatened violence or offered terms. She had simply said no to his entire civilization, and somehow that single word had brought the galaxy's most powerful empire to its knees. "How?" he whispered. Hayes smiled. "Because you made the same mistake that every conqueror makes. You assumed that power comes from the ability to force people to choose between bad options. But real power comes from the ability to refuse to choose at all." Within 72 hours of first contact, the Zephyrian fleet had withdrawn completely. From Earth's solar system, the ships that had seemed so ominous hanging over human cities were gone, leaving only clear skies and a planet full of people who suddenly understood their own strength. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of Earth's first interstellar vessel, looking out at stars that no longer seemed like distant points of light but like destinations waiting to be explored. Major Kate Sullivan joined him, along with the surviving members of their command staff. "Do you think they'll be back?" Sullivan asked. Morrison considered the question carefully. The intelligence report suggested that the Zephyrian Confederation was facing internal revolts on a dozen worlds. 3 member species had declared complete independence. The psychological foundations of their empire were cracking under the weight of a simple idea, that conquest was not inevitable. "Maybe," he said finally. "But if they do come back, we know what our answer will be." Dr. Lisa Chang approached them, carrying a tablet filled with communication intercepts from across the galaxy. "Actually, I don't think they'll be back anytime soon. We're intercepting messages from Confederation worlds throughout their territory. The word no has become a symbol of resistance. Some planets are using it as a rallying cry for independence movements." Colonel Williams joined the group, grinning broadly. "It gets better. We're getting reports that the Zephyrian military is dealing with mass resignations. Apparently, when soldiers start questioning whether conquest is morally justified, it becomes very difficult to maintain an invasion force." The transformation was remarkable. In less than a week, humanity had gone from facing extinction to becoming the catalyst for a galactic revolution. They had not won through superior technology or military might, but through something much more powerful: the simple refusal to accept that they had no choice. President Hayes, who had returned to Earth as a hero, addressed the planet in a speech that was broadcast to every human settlement and transmitted to listening posts throughout the galaxy. "We have learned something important about ourselves and about the universe," she said. "Power is not the ability to force others to choose between bad options. Power is the courage to reject those choices entirely and create new possibilities." As Earth began to rebuild and prepare for its new role as a beacon of resistance in the galaxy, one word echoed through the halls of government, military bases, and civilian homes. It was the word that had broken an empire and freed countless worlds from tyranny. The word was simple, powerful, and eternal. No. And across the galaxy, other species were learning to say it too.